I never thought I'd be standing here, in front of a crowd of young soldiers at Fort Benning, Georgia, being introduced as some kind of hero. The afternoon sun beat down on the parade ground, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back beneath my dress uniform. 40 years had passed since Vietnam, but sometimes it felt like yesterday. Other times it felt like a lifetime that belonged to someone else entirely. My name is James Mitchell, and for most of my adult life I've been known as the guy who doesn't talk about the war. While other veterans gathered at the VFW Hall in my hometown of Augusta, swapping stories over beer and cigarettes, I stayed home. When my grandkids asked about my service, I'd ruffle their hair and change the subject. When reporters occasionally tracked me down after someone mentioned my name in connection with a particular firefight near the Cambodian border in 1971, I politely declined every interview. The truth is, I didn't think I deserved the attention. What happened that day in the jungle wasn't heroism. It was chaos, terror, and split-second decisions that haunted my dreams for decades. I did what I had to do to bring my brothers home, nothing more. The army disagreed and pinned medals on my chest that felt like weights I couldn't shake off. Colonel Sarah Henderson, the base commander, was wrapping up my introduction. And so, it is my honor to welcome Sergeant Major James Mitchell, retired, to speak with our newest Rangers about leadership under fire. The applause was polite but enthusiastic. These kids, and they were kids to me, barely in their 20s, had no idea what real combat felt like. They'd trained hard, learned tactics, mastered weapon systems that would have seemed like science fiction in my day. But there's a difference between knowing and experiencing, between simulation and the real thing where bullets don't reset and the dead don't respawn. I stepped up to the microphone, my hands shaking slightly. At 72 years old, I'd given exactly 3 speeches about my military service. This was number 4, and only because Colonel Henderson had been persistent to the point of annoyance. She'd called me monthly for 6 months until I finally agreed. "Thank you, Colonel," I began, my voice gravelly. "I'm not much of a speaker, so bear with me. I'm here because Colonel Henderson seems to think I have something valuable to share with you all. Honestly, I'm not so sure about that." A few polite chuckles rippled through the audience. I scanned the faces, eager, attentive, hungry for wisdom from an old warhorse. What could I possibly tell them that their instructors hadn't already drilled into their heads? "Leadership isn't about being the loudest voice or the toughest guy in the room," I continued, falling back on safe platitudes. "It's about making sure everyone gets home. It's about—" That's when I saw him. He was standing at the back of the assembly, partially obscured by a support column. Not in uniform, civilian clothes, khaki pants, and a button-down shirt. He was older than the soldiers, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and a face that made my heart stop. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing tricks on me. The Georgia heat could do that sometimes, but no, he was real, and he was staring directly at me with an intensity that made my mouth go dry. I fumbled my words, lost my train of thought completely. "I'm sorry, Excuse me for a moment." The confusion in the audience was palpable. Colonel Henderson looked concerned, probably thinking I was having a medical episode. Maybe I was. My chest felt tight, and the edges of my vision blurred. I gripped the podium to steady myself. "Are you all right, Sergeant Major?" Colonel Henderson whispered, approaching me. I need a minute," I managed to say. She quickly stepped in, taking the microphone. "Let's take a brief break, everyone. 5 minutes." I stumbled off the stage, my eyes never leaving the man at the back. He didn't move, didn't look away. As I got closer, details became clearer. The shape of his nose, the set of his jaw, the way he stood with his weight slightly forward, as if ready to move at a moment's notice. "Sergeant Major Mitchell," he said when I was close enough to hear. His English was perfect, barely accented. "Who are you?" I asked, though somewhere deep in my bones I already knew. "My name is Nguyen Thanh," he said. "I believe you knew my father." The world tilted. I'd spent 40 years trying to forget that name, that face, that impossible day in the jungle when everything I thought I knew about war and humanity got turned inside out. And here was his son, standing in front of me on a US Army base in Georgia, looking at me with eyes that held no hatred, only questions. "Your father," I couldn't finish the sentence, "is dead," Nguyen Thanh said simply. "He died 10 years ago, but before he died he told me a story about an American soldier who could have killed him but didn't, a story he made me promise to investigate, to verify, because all his life people called him a liar. They said it never happened, that he made it up to seem important, to give meaning to his survival when so many others died." My legs felt weak. This isn't the place for this conversation. Then where? He asked. I've been trying to reach you for 3 years, Mr. Mitchell. You don't answer letters, you don't return calls. This was the only way. I looked back at the assembly area where hundreds of young soldiers were milling about, waiting for me to return. Colonel Henderson was watching with barely concealed worry. The Hampton Inn off exit 42, I said quickly. Room 314, tonight at 7, but I'm not promising anything. I don't need promises, Nguyen Than replied. I just need the truth. He turned and walked away before I could respond, disappearing around the corner of the building like a ghost, which in a way, I suppose he was. A ghost from a past I'd tried so hard to bury. I somehow made it through the rest of the speech, though I couldn't tell you what I said. The words came automatically, muscle memory from years of giving safety briefs and mission debriefs. The soldiers seemed satisfied. Colonel Henderson thanked me profusely afterward, mentioning something about inspiration and tradition. I nodded, shook hands, signed a few autographs. All I could think about was 7 o'clock. The drive from Fort Benning to my hotel usually took 20 minutes. That afternoon I took the long way, needing time to think, to remember, to prepare myself for a conversation I'd spent 4 decades avoiding. Augusta was beautiful in late September. The oppressive summer heat had finally broken, leaving behind clear skies and temperatures that reminded me why I'd chosen to retire in Georgia. The trees along Washington Road were beginning their slow transformation, hints of gold appearing among the green. It should have been peaceful. Instead, my mind was racing backward through time. 1971, I was 24 years old, a sergeant in the 75th Ranger Regiment, leading a reconnaissance patrol in the jungles near the Cambodian border. We'd been in country for 7 months, and I'd already seen more death than any young man should witness in a lifetime. My squad was good, tough, disciplined, brothers who'd walked through fire for each other. The mission was straightforward: gather intelligence on reported North Vietnamese army movements in our sector. We'd done dozens of similar patrols, but this one was different. This one changed everything. I pulled into the hotel parking lot and sat in my truck for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. My phone buzzed, a text from my daughter, Rachel, asking how the speech went. I responded with a thumbs-up emoji, too distracted to write anything substantial. Inside my room, I paced like a caged animal. The walls felt like they were closing in. I tried to watch TV but couldn't focus. Tried to read, but the words swam on the page. Finally, at 6:30, I gave up and just sat in the chair by the window watching the parking lot. At precisely 7 o'clock, a rental car pulled into the space below my window. Nguyen Than emerged, looking around briefly before heading toward the building entrance. My heart hammered in my chest. The knock on my door was firm but not aggressive. I opened it to find him standing there, holding a worn leather satchel. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said. I stepped aside to let him in. He moved carefully, respectfully, taking in the room with the observant eyes of someone trained to assess situations quickly. Military training, perhaps, or just the inherited wariness of someone whose family survived a brutal war. "Can I get you something? Water? Coffee?" I asked, falling back on Southern hospitality. "Water would be fine, thank you." I grabbed 2 bottles from the mini fridge and we sat facing each other, him on the desk chair, me in the armchair by the window. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "You look like him," I finally said. "Your father. The resemblance is striking." Nguyen Than nodded. "I'm told I inherited his features, his stubbornness too." He paused, then opened the satchel and pulled out an old photograph, placing it on the small table between us. "This is him, 1970. Before the battle that changed his life." I picked up the photo with trembling hands. There he was, young, determined, wearing the uniform of the North Vietnamese Army. Lieutenant Nguyen Van Duc, the man I'd carried on my back for 3 miles through hostile jungle while my own squad covered our retreat. The enemy soldier I'd saved instead of killed. He kept this story secret for many years, Nguyen Than continued. In Vietnam, after the war, there was no room for complexity. The Americans were the enemy, full stop. To admit that one had shown mercy, had acted with humanity, it complicated the narrative. People didn't want complicated. They wanted heroes and villains. "I understand that," I said quietly. "It wasn't much different here, but in his final years, my father couldn't stay silent anymore. He told me, my brother, my sister. He told us about the American sergeant who found him wounded after an ambush, who could have finished him off or left him to die, but instead rendered aid and carried him to safety. He told us about the small village where you left him with civilians, who could get him medical attention. I closed my eyes and I was there again. The humidity so thick you could barely breathe, the smell of cordite and blood. The sound of my men arguing about what to do with the wounded NVA officer we'd stumbled upon during our extraction. Your father was in bad shape, I said, opening my eyes. Gunshot wound to the abdomen, another to his leg. He should have been dead already. Probably would have been if we'd left him. Why didn't you? Nguyen Thanh asked. My father asked himself that question for 40 years. Why would an American soldier risk his own life and the lives of his squad to save an enemy? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot. A family was unloading suitcases from their car. Mom, dad, 2 kids. Normal life, peaceful life, a world away from the one I'd inhabited in 1971. Because he reminded me of myself, I said finally. When I got close enough to see his face, to see his eyes, I saw fear and pain and a desperate will to live. The same things I'd seen in the mirror every morning, the same things I'd seen in my brothers' faces during firefights. He wasn't a target anymore. He was just a man who didn't want to die. Some of your men objected, didn't they? Nguyen Thanh asked. I nodded. Yeah, especially Martinez. He'd lost his best friend 2 weeks earlier in an ambush, wanted revenge, wanted me to leave your father, or worse. We almost came to blows right there in the jungle. But you didn't leave him, no. I pulled rank, told them we were taking him with us, made it clear that was an order, not a suggestion. I turned back to face Nguyen Thanh. It was the longest 3 miles of my life. We were exposed, vulnerable, moving slow because of the extra weight. Any moment I expected NVA soldiers to appear and finish what the ambush started. My father remembered very little of that journey, Nguyen Thanh said. He'd lost a lot of blood, drifted in and out of consciousness. But he remembered your voice. You talked to him, kept him awake. I didn't want him going into shock, I explained. Figured if I kept talking, kept him responding, he'd have a better chance. Do you remember what you talked about? I smiled sadly. Baseball. I talked about baseball, of all things. The Yankees, Mickey Mantle. He didn't understand a word, but it didn't matter. Just the sound of a voice. Human connection in the middle of hell. Nguyen Thanh reached into his satchel again and pulled out a notebook, old weathered, filled with Vietnamese writing. My father kept a journal after the war, he said. He wrote down everything he remembered about that day. He described you. Tall, red hair, freckles, a scar above your left eyebrow. Unconsciously, I touched the scar. A souvenir from a bar fight in basic training. He wrote about the village, how you argued with the elders to take him in, how you left medical supplies. He wrote about watching you and your squad disappear back into the jungle, expecting never to see or know anything about you again. I reported the incident when we got back to base, I said. My CO wasn't happy. There was talk of an investigation, possible charges for aiding the enemy, but things were chaotic then, lots of units getting moved around, priorities shifting. It got buried in paperwork and eventually forgotten, or so I thought. Nguyen Thanh stood and walked to where I was standing by the window. We were about the same height, both carrying the weight of inherited stories. For years, my father tried to find information about you, he said. He wrote letters to American veteran organizations, contacted journalists, even reached out to the US Embassy in Hanoi. Nothing came of it. People either couldn't help or didn't believe him. Some told him he was wasting his time, that no American soldier would have done what he described. That must have been hard for him, I said. It was worse than hard. It consumed him. He became known in our village as the man with the impossible story. People humored him, but few believed. Some suggested the trauma had confused his memories, that perhaps he'd been saved by Vietnamese civilians and later conflated them with American soldiers in his damaged mind. I felt a pang of guilt. All these years I'd been trying to forget, while Nguyen Van Duc had been fighting to be believed. 2 men, former enemies, bound by the same moment in time, dealing with it in opposite ways. After my father died, Nguyen Thanh continued, I promised him I'd keep looking. I promised I'd find the truth. It became my mission. I learned English, studied American military records, contacted dozens of veterans groups, 3 years of dead ends and false leads. How did you finally find me? I asked. Luck, mostly, and the internet. Someone posted a digitized copy of an after-action report from your unit, dated April 1971. It mentioned a successful reconnaissance patrol that encountered enemy forces and sustained light casualties. There was a note, barely legible in the scan, about an incident regarding the treatment of a wounded enemy combatant. Your name was in the signature block. I'll be damned, I muttered. All this time it was sitting in some archive. From there it wasn't hard to track you down. public records, voter registration, social media posts by your family members. The modern world makes it difficult to stay hidden. I looked at him directly. What do you want from me, Nguyen Than? What do you hope to gain from this? He met my gaze without flinching. Validation. Not for me, but for my father's memory. I want to publish his story, the full story, with your corroboration. I want people to know that even in war, even in the darkest circumstances, humanity can prevail, that enemies can choose mercy. That's a dangerous narrative, I said. Some people won't want to hear it. Veterans on both sides have built their identities around the righteousness of their cause. This complicates that. Truth always complicates things, he replied. But don't we owe it to the next generation? These young soldiers you spoke to today, don't they deserve to know that courage isn't just about pulling triggers? That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to kill? I thought about those faces at Fort Benning, eager and determined, ready to deploy to places I'd never heard of to fight enemies they'd never met. What would this story teach them? You're asking me to relive the worst day of my life, I said, to put my name to something that might make me a pariah in my own community. Do you know how many people think I'm already a coward for not talking about my service? How many assume my silence means I have something to hide? I'm not asking you to relive anything, Nguyen Than said gently. I'm asking you to transform it, to turn pain into purpose. My father did that. He went on to become a doctor, spent his life saving people regardless of who they were or which side they'd fought on. He said you taught him that. I taught him. I laughed bitterly. I was just trying to survive, trying to make a decision I could live with. And you've lived with it for 40 years. How's that working out? The question hit harder than expected. How was it working out? The nightmares, the isolation, the distance I'd kept from my own family because I couldn't explain what I'd experienced. The way I flinched at loud noises and couldn't watch fireworks without my heart racing. Not great, I admitted. Nguyen Than reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of surprising intimacy given we'd only met hours ago. Then let's make something good from it, together. My father saved dozens of lives as a doctor. Maybe this story can save a few more. Maybe it can help soldiers on both sides understand that the enemy is human too, that mercy is strength, not weakness. I walked back to the chair and sat down heavily. My entire adult life, I'd built walls around that day, around Vietnam, around everything associated with the war. And here was this man, the son of the man I'd saved, asking me to tear those walls down brick by brick. I need to think about this, I said finally. Of course. Take all the time you need. I'm staying in town for a few days. Here's my number. He handed me a card. But Mr. Mitchell, before I go, I want to show you something else. He pulled out one more item from his satchel, a small wooden box intricately carved. He opened it to reveal a medal tarnished with age but still recognizable. This was my father's combat medal, he explained. He wanted me to give it to you. Said you earned it more than he did. I can't take that, I protested. You already did. The moment you picked him up and carried him through that jungle. The moment you chose to see him as a human being instead of a target. That's what this medal represents. Not just valor in combat, but valor in choosing humanity. He placed the box on the table and stood to leave. Wait, I said. Your father, did he have a good life after the war? Nguyen Than smiled for the first time since entering my room. He did. He married, had 3 children, practiced medicine for 30 years. He never forgot what you did, but he didn't let it define him either. He used it as inspiration to be better, to do better. I think he'd want the same for you. After he left, I sat in the darkening room, holding the wooden box. The metal inside felt impossibly heavy, weighted with obligation and memory, and the possibility of redemption I'd never allowed myself to consider. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the small desk in my hotel room and did something I hadn't done in 40 years. I wrote about Vietnam. Not the sanitized version I'd given in official reports, but the truth, the fear, the doubt, the moral complexity of war, and that day in April 1971 when I made a choice that saved a life and haunted my own. By morning, I had 10 pages of cramped handwriting, coffee-stained and tear-stained, but honest. I stared at those pages as the sun rose over Augusta, wondering if I had the courage to share them. My phone rang at 8 a.m. Rachel, my daughter. Dad, I heard through the grapevine that your speech yesterday was amazing, she said. Colonel Henderson told someone who told someone who told me. She said you really opened up about your service. It was complicated, I replied. Everything about you and Vietnam is complicated, Rachel said, not unkindly. But maybe that's okay. Maybe complicated is more honest than simple. After we hung up, I made a decision. I called Nguyen Thanh. Can you meet me at Savannah National Cemetery? I asked. Today, if possible. Of course. What time? Noon. I want to show you something. The cemetery was a 90-minute drive, but I needed to make this journey. Among the white headstones and perfectly manicured grass were buried men I'd served with, friends who'd come home but never really left the war behind. Martinez was here, having died by his own hand in 1985, unable to shake the demons. Thompson, killed in a car accident, but whose family swore he'd died that day in the jungle and just forgot to fall down. Wilson, who made it to 60 before a heart attack claimed him. Nguyen Thanh arrived precisely at noon, wearing a dark suit appropriate for a cemetery. We walked among the graves in silence for a while, before I stopped at one in particular. Private First Class David Chen, I said, reading the headstone. 20 years old, killed in action April 12, 1971, 3 days after we carried your father out of that jungle. I'm sorry, Nguyen Thanh said quietly. Chen was the one who convinced the others to help me, I continued. When Martinez wanted to leave your father, when the others were scared and angry, Chen said, "We're supposed to be better than them. Let's prove it." He was shot during our extraction, never made it home. I knelt and placed my hand on the cold marble. I've visited his grave every year since his parents passed. I needed them to know their son mattered, that his death meant something. But I never told them the full story. How could I? How could I explain that their son died in part because we chose to save an enemy soldier? Nguyen Thanh knelt beside me. His death wasn't in vain. He was right. You were better. You all were. That choice, that moment of humanity in the midst of inhumanity, rippled forward through time. My father saved hundreds of lives as a doctor. I became a teacher, inspired by his story, and I've taught thousands of students. Some of them are doctors now, engineers, teachers themselves. That's Chen's legacy too. I never thought of it that way, I admitted. Maybe it's time you did. We spent another hour in the cemetery, and I told him stories. Not just about the day we saved his father, but about the men buried here, the brothers I'd lost, the weight I'd carried. He listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just being present. As we walked back to our cars, I said, "I'll do it. I'll tell the story publicly, but I have conditions. Name them. First, we tell the complete truth, not a sanitized version, not propaganda for either side. The fear, the anger, the complexity, all of it. Agreed. Second, we include the men who didn't make it. This isn't just about me and your father. It's about Chen and Thompson and all the others who paid the price for that decision." Absolutely. Third, we donate any proceeds from the story to organizations that help veterans, American and Vietnamese, deal with the aftermath of war. Nguyen Thanh extended his hand. "You have my word on all three conditions." We shook hands and I felt something shift inside me. Not quite healing, not yet peace, but movement. Forward movement for the first time in decades. Over the next 3 months, Nguyen Thanh and I worked together to piece together the full story. We interviewed other members of my old squad who were still alive. We gathered documentation from military archives. We traveled to Vietnam, where I met Nguyen Van Duc's widow and his other children. Standing in the village where we left him 40 years ago, now prosperous and peaceful, I finally allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, that impossible choice had been the right one. The article was published in a major military history journal, and the response was overwhelming. Some veterans criticized me, calling me a traitor or a fool. Others thanked me, saying the story gave them permission to acknowledge their own complicated feelings about war and enemy combatants. Young soldiers reached out, asking questions about moral decision-making in combat situations. Colonel Henderson invited me back to Fort Benning for another speech, this time with Nguyen Thanh beside me. Standing before a new audience of Rangers, I told the story without flinching, without minimizing the cost or the complexity. Leadership in combat isn't always about tactical decisions, I concluded. Sometimes it's about moral ones. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the most important. Private Chen knew that when he was 20 years old. It took me 50 years to understand what he grasped in an instant. After the speech, a young lieutenant approached us, earnest and thoughtful. "Sir, what do you want us to take away from this story?" he asked. I looked at Nguyen Thanh, then back at the lieutenant. "That enemies are people too," I said. "That mercy is a form of courage. That the choices we make in our darkest moments define us more than the medals on our chests or the battles on our records, and that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is refuse to forget their own humanity. That evening, I drove home to Augusta, but instead of feeling drained, I felt lighter. The weight I'd carried for 40 years hadn't disappeared. It never would, but it had transformed into something I could bear, something meaningful. Rachel and her family were waiting at my house with dinner and hugs. My grandson, 12 years old and fascinated by military history, had a dozen questions about the story he'd read online. "Grandpa, were you scared?" he asked as we sat on the porch after dinner. "Terrified," I admitted, "the whole time. But you did it anyway." "That's what courage is," I said, putting my arm around him. "Not the absence of fear, but doing what's right despite it." Later that night, alone in my study, I opened the wooden box Nguyen Than had given me. The tarnished medal caught the lamplight, and I thought about the two men it represented, Nguyen Van Duc, who'd survived impossible odds and spent his life healing others, and myself, who'd made a choice in the jungle that I'd spent decades trying to understand. For years, I'd denied the story when people asked, embarrassed by the attention, uncertain about the meaning. But now, finally, I understood. It wasn't a story about heroism or cowardice, about Americans or Vietnamese, about winners or losers. It was a story about the persistent, stubborn humanity that endures even in the worst circumstances, about connections that transcend conflict, and about the redemption that comes from speaking truth. The enemy's son had confirmed it, but more than that, he'd helped me see it clearly for the first time. Some stories need to be told, not because they're easy or comfortable, but because they're true, and the truth, however complicated, is always worth the telling.